I'm Greg Wells. I'm a musician who, over the years, osmosed into a record producer and a songwriter and a mix engineer. I'm from Peterborough, Ontario, Canada. It's a town now about 70,000 people, maybe 72,000 people, 2 hours northeast of Toronto. Beautiful lakes, beautiful trees, big, angry mosquitoes, and pretty significant winters. It's a beautiful town. Despite being a beautiful town, I found it very easy to leave it, unfortunately, because this is, I'm an old man, so this is pre-electricity. Um, we got 3 channels on TV when I was a little boy in the 70s, and especially at the time, it was a real factory town. Quaker Oats was there, West Clocks was there, General Electric, GE was there. It was called Canadian General Electric, CGE, and all kinds of other factories that I wasn't even aware of. Outboard Marine was a big one, cottage country, everyone driving motorboats. It was a real blue-collar town, and there wasn't much of a cultural scene there. And I was really drawn like a moth to the flame to music and had real trouble finding support for that. I remember as a 5-year-old boy, I saw Arthur Duncan tap dancing on the Lawrence Welk show, and Michael Jackson dancing amazingly with the Jackson 5. And I said to my mom, like, I'd love to take some tap dancing lessons. And she tried to find it, and like there were no tap dancing lessons at the time. Maybe there are now. It's changed a lot, but I was really drawn to Toronto, and I'd see clips of New York and just sort of, where is this other world? I always, at the time, had the feeling that I wasn't in the right place. Now, having said that, at the age of 50, I just turned 50, looking back on all of that, I would not change a thing about it. I would not change a thing. It gave me, and continues to give me, a perspective on the world. It gives me a hunger. There's a really strong exoticism for me with art and music in particular. And just being creative, being around people that are not afraid to express themselves and be creative and not fit in. I find that really, really, really appealing, and I encourage it all the time. I think it leads to happier people and a happier world, and it leads to great stories, and this is all we're doing here is storytelling, and we're all suckers for a great story. So I had a tough time growing up there. I got beat up a lot. I found it easy to leave, but I honestly wouldn't change anything about it at this point. Even though at the time I was thinking, it'd be great to be a big city kid. And I remember watching the TV show Fame. It came on when I was just entering 9th grade, or grade 9, as we say in Canada, and I was about to turn 14. And I saw the clip of that girl who was new to this school of the performing arts in Manhattan. She was carrying her cello to school, and I'm just thinking, where's this school? Who are these people? I want to be that. It all makes sense in hindsight. It didn't make a lot of sense at the time, but that's where I'm from. I am told by a woman named Bonnie Herr, who was a family friend at the time when I was a little baby. And at the time she was in high school, and she was a drummer, and she had a drum set as a senior in high school. And she would sometimes be my babysitter when I was really young, like 4 or 5, 6, 7 months old. And she went on to be a percussionist in a symphony orchestra, and a great teacher, a music teacher. And she swears that I can't corroborate it because I don't remember, but she swears that I was drumming on the side of the crib at 6 months old, not just banging, but like actually playing grooves, like a consistent beat. And she said she'd never seen anything like it. I don't know where that came from. There wasn't a lot of music in my house. It was, if there was, it was played very quietly, and it didn't really have drums in it. I didn't grow up with parents that had kind of forward-leaning hip taste. They were listening to a lot of older show tunes and very light classical music and stuff that was just sort of relaxing and beautiful, and played very low. And then they would talk over it, talk about the weather or talk about whatever. I love my parents, but musically we did not have a musically rocking house at all. And I was just drawn to drums. I remember, I'll probably start crying talking about this, but my mom took me to a couple of really cool things that I loved. They both happened when I was 3. We went to a Salvation Army Christmas concert in the Salvation Army Church in Peterborough. And there was a guy named Murray Manders, who is probably still alive and well in Peterborough, and he was the local percussionist, and he was playing some timpani. He had 2 kettle drums, we called them, but they're timpani. And I was sitting in the balcony with my mom watching this, and every time he hit the timpani, I just felt like I was being beamed up to this, to the mothership. I couldn't believe what I was feeling. And I said to my mom when it was over, can we please just go look at those drums? Can we just go stand beside the stage? And we did, and he was still there, and my mom said, is it okay if my son touches the drum? And I was just happy to just touch it, And he said, sure. And I remember she lifted me up, I was 3, and put me up on the stage, and he picked me up and he let me hit the timpani with one of those mallets, and that was it, game over. I was completely hooked. It was even better than I thought it would be. It makes me emotional talking about this. And then when I was 3.5, probably out of complete boredom, but my mom took me in the afternoon to see a matinee show of the movie, the Norman Jewison film, Jesus Christ Superstar. And again, I'm 3.5, like it's 1972 in downtown Peterborough, and I'm watching this thing, and it's a pretty intense movie. And I didn't really understand what was going on in terms of the subtext of everything. I just knew there was amazing singing, amazing energy, amazing dancing, and I just thought, whatever this is, that's all I want to do. That's it. I hear about people that become veterinarians because they got bit by a dog. So that movie was the dog that bit me. And I really feel like, everything I do is an extension of what I experienced that day. It just imprinted like being hit in the face with a comet, And then I would go home and just bang on the table. We couldn't, this is slightly violin, but we couldn't afford drums. So I would just bang the furniture. And I had a baby seat that was made of styrofoam. This is way before there were any kind of newer. It was totally unsafe, but it sounded great. And I would hit it. And then we finally got some little drumsticks, and I would hit it with that. I knew what every pillow and armrest and cushion in our home sounded like. And we had an upright piano, which my mom still has. And hopefully one day I will have in my life. And that became my first drum set. And literally just pounded the crap out of it. And then eventually discovered kind of harmonies and melodies and played piano very rhythmically. And my mom started me around 5 years old at reading some real simple music notation. And then at 7, we found a great piano teacher named Marjorie Engels. And she was cool. She wore mismatched socks, and she just dressed real funky, and she was into jazz and classical music. And I think she recognized that I was a frustrated drummer. And she divided my piano lesson where it was 30-minute lesson. The first 15 minutes was rhythmic, simple jazz that I could play and love, which is mostly boogie woogie, which I love. You just really drive like that in the left hand. And I loved it. And then the second half was more like simple Bach and Brahms and Beethoven and still like an introduction to classical music. I didn't like that as much, but then I started to really like it. And she introduced some kind of cool, more rhythmic classical pieces. And then she moved to England 2 years later and hooked me up with a teacher in my hometown, Rick Pritchard, who was a really great piano player, all classical. And he put me on sort of a fast track of classical music. And I couldn't believe I was that deep into classical music on piano, but I really was, with his guidance and great teaching. I think I was lucky that I had a strong technique. I could play difficult stuff. I could play fast and clear. And so I started taking on pieces that I didn't have the emotional maturity to play, but I could play them. And I enjoyed playing them. And Rick also let me pick pieces that I liked rather than make me play pieces I didn't like. I think maybe that was part of my deal of taking piano lessons. I had to like what I was playing. Now, as a result of that, I know a lot about certain composers, and I know nothing about like Chopin or Schumann or Mozart, things that sounded happy or romantic. I did not get those emotions when I was 12 or 10 or 14. I liked angry and fast and rhythmic, or like really kind of sad and spooky. I'm still sort of wired that way. And started competing in music festivals, and it was actually going well, and I was like winning awards and getting all this validation, and it almost kind of felt disingenuous to me, and in a way that I couldn't put my finger on. I didn't know why it didn't feel right, but I started getting really interested in the thought of somehow getting a drum set, and really actually like maybe I could be a drummer. At that point I sort of thought, well, I guess it's not in the cards for me to be a drummer, but I couldn't let it go. I always was drumming in my head. I still do all the time. It's constantly drumming. And I was playing church organ at that point by 12 or 13, and saved up enough money to buy a Westbury drum set, it's a Canadian drum company that's no longer in existence. And they were used. I remember going to this man's basement with my dad in Peterborough, and we got them. And I pounded the crap out of them, as long as I could. And then at some point I sold them and turned that into a Silvertone guitar that came from Japan, and a terrible amplifier, and a used Big Muff distortion pedal. And I did that for the next 2 years of high school, and quit classical piano and sort of stopped playing piano and devoted myself to drums and guitar, and would borrow the high school bass and teach myself bass. Really just listen to records. I was always listening to records and jamming along with stuff. Never having a clue, by the way, if I was good at music, great at music, not so good at music, terrible at music. I had no idea. I honestly did not know. The only thing I knew is that I was obsessed with it. I couldn't think about anything else. I really couldn't. And I joined every band that would have me. I was in, a Black Sabbath cover band. I was in Peterborough punk bands. I was in the Peterborough Civic Concert Band, which played sort of marching music most of the time. I got involved with the Peterborough Symphony Orchestra. There is one, which is great. And playing for choirs and continuing to play church organ all through my teens. That was my main job. And as I got older and a better organist, every year I seemed to be at a bigger church with a better organ. And I actually miss that. There's nothing like playing a pipe organ with a great congregation, with great singers. And some of those hymns are sort of dirgy, and some are just beautiful. They're beautiful pieces of music, and the feeling of accompanying that amount of singers in a nice acoustic room, like a well-built church. There's no feeling like that at all. And then started hearing about Humber College. They had a contemporary music program, and that sounded good to me. And it was the only way I could think of to test the waters outside of my hometown. And I auditioned for it, and I got in. I decided to go back to piano studies. So I went as a piano major, and once I was there, I started drumming a lot in different bands and even playing some guitar. And it was just really fun meeting other musicians from around Canada who were my age or a little bit older. The thing I didn't know about Humber is it was mostly a hardcore early 60s bebop school. And I didn't play a note of bebop. I'd really only heard sort of a little bit of jazz. It was a language I really didn't speak. And I improvised all the time with the piano, but I just made stuff up. And I remember people in Toronto, my first year at the college, and they would say, you must listen to a lot of Keith Jarrett and Chick Corea. And I didn't. They were not an influence on me because I just, my parents really weren't into music, and I didn't have an older sibling. I am the oldest kid. I have a younger brother, Rob. So I was doing sort of my own version of jazz, but it was really, I don't know. I don't know what it sounded like. I wish I had some recordings of it. And then I thought, I have to figure out how to do this, or I'm going to go back to Peterborough, and that didn't feel like the right move. So I tried really hard to learn the language of jazz in whatever backwards way I could. And I just listened a lot, and had some fantastic teachers at Humber. And Humber continues to be an incredible school. It's even better now. They have a beautiful recording studio that I go back and do clinics in every couple of years. Like, grab some students and we record a song that they wrote, and I produce it and walk them through it like it's a real session, like what we are doing here. And in fact, I highly recommend it as a learning institution. Plus, it's subsidized by the Canadian government, which makes it more affordable for students. That enabled me to pay my own way through college. I paid for every penny of it, but I think the government paid for half of it. And then in Toronto, just did the same thing. Just kept joining every band that would have me. I played some bands. I was the drummer, some I was the guitar player, some I was the bass player, some I was the piano player, and just kept doing it. And yeah, on and on. I mean, that's a very long answer, and I've had some coffee and the caffeine's kicking in, but that was my entry point into music. It was really like walking backwards into it. I was not guided by a cool mentor. I did have some great classical piano teachers, and that was incredible, although I always knew like that's not going to be my career, even though maybe they thought it might be. Maybe they didn't think that, I don't know, but that's how I launched into all of this. By the way, I had no idea that the job I have now even existed, like not a clue. I had no idea what a record producer was. At the time, I remember thinking the brass ring would be to be a session musician. If I could ever figure out how to be a studio musician in Toronto, I remember in high school writing an essay about it, like that's the pinnacle. Which I wound up becoming in Toronto, and then eventually here in Los Angeles. And it was that journey that turned me on to, that's what a record producer. It's like a movie director. Oh, maybe I should try that. Maybe one day I could do that. It's a funny thing about goals, like, by the time you actually get to the goal that you set at some point, which I think is important, but I think it's as important to remain open and flexible to the things you discover along the way. And by the time, you could be 5 years out from reaching your goal or 10 years out. By the time you get there, you're privy to stuff that you didn't know about before. And many ceilings have become your new floor, and then that ceiling becomes your floor, and that ceiling becomes your floor, and you just see more stuff. You're going higher up the mountain, you got a better view. And there's more destinations. I did not know that I would be doing what I am doing right now professionally, but I'm really happy I am. And it all started from, wanting to tap dance and watching an incredible movie that is dated really badly, and it actually looks more like an SNL skit right now. I say that with no disrespect to the movie. It means so much to me, but I've tried to show it to younger people, and they're like, what? They don't quite get it. I'm an old man. The instruments that I try to play are drums, piano, and obvious offshoots of being a piano player, like Hammond B3. I spent a lot of time with Hammond B3 and sort of learned and was shown how to kind of make it talk and certain things about it. And I studied pipe organ with a great teacher in my hometown named Sid Burrell, who's a fantastic organ. He's a member of the Royal College of Organists out of London. How he wound up in Peterborough, I don't know. He's still there, happily. He's a beast of a musician, and he taught me, three different keyboards, 3 manual pipe organ, where the left hand doesn't play the bass notes, the left hand's like another right hand, and your feet play the bass notes. It's a real rewiring, and it takes a long time to get that going. I play guitar. I play bass. 1 year I studied 4-mallet marimba. I can't really do that anymore. You got to keep that up. But I gave a concert once on 4 mallets on 1 marimba. What else? Instruments. I played some trumpet in high school. I was given a cello by an old girlfriend for my birthday. It's just a student cello. And I kind of taught myself how to play that. I think that's it. When I played with Katy Lang, the great singer Katy Lang, I played with her for 3 years when I was 23 years old, from 1992 to 94. And her musical partner and co-producer and co-writer is a fantastic musician named Ben Mink. And I'd known about Ben forever. He was, very well known in the Toronto musician scene. And he was really sweet to me when I was a kid on tour with them. And at some point, he said, "Here, try playing my violin." Because actually with Katy, I was called Multi. She still calls me Multi to this day. She never calls me Greg. I still, in emails from her, we're still in touch. She just said, "Happy birthday, Multi," to me when I turned 50 back in September. And so I had like a set of vibes on stage. I had a keyboard rig, electric and acoustic guitar. I had a percussion rig. I was playing accordion on some songs. It was all over the place. And Ben, I think between sound check and a gig, he said, "Try playing my violin." So I did. And I don't play violin, but I could get notes out of it. And he said, "You know what? You got really good hand-eye coordination." And I'd never been told that, and I didn't know that. He said, "I think maybe that's why it's easy for you to pick up instruments and play them." So maybe that's helped, I mean, he definitely thought it did. It was a nice objective observation. I think that's why I make a lot of noise on a lot of different things. Also, as a kid, I didn't know that it was weird to play more than one instrument. And I gotta say, today, it's not weird. Like, there's all kinds of people that I meet, younger people, who play lots of instruments, and that's just fine. But when I grew up in the 1500s, it was pretty rare. The challenge with making noise on a bunch of different instruments is to keep my chops up, to keep my ability to do that, to be able to play bass, which has its own physical challenges, or guitar, same thing, calluses on your fingers, you need that. Drums, a whole other set of calluses, a whole other set of, brain to body connections, and piano, all of it. And quite frankly, I don't play as well as I used to, because months will go by where I don't drum. Months will go by where I don't really play piano. Sometimes years will go by without me playing guitar, depending on whomever I'm working with. And what's happened is I've become really, really obsessed. Like, there's a part of me that's kind of like mournful about that. And I'm like, I really should be practicing every day. I've never been into practicing. I was luckily given a really strong technique where I can play fast. I can play fast on drums, play fast on guitar, fast on piano. I can't play quite as fast as I used to be able to, but I'm also not working at it, because that matters less to me now than it did when I was a teenager or in my 20s. The only thing that matters to me now is to make the best possible recording I can make. Thinking like a movie director, to try and make the best possible movie I can make, and whatever that takes. And sometimes that takes me getting totally out of the way and just making sure the train stays on the track. Conversely, sometimes it is the opposite. Like, I'm doing everything. I'm, completely like nose deep in the garden. I'm playing everything. I'm writing, I'm producing, I'm mixing. And then often it's some point in between all that stuff. But I gotta say, when I moved to Los Angeles, I didn't bring any drums, because I just knew I'd be living in an apartment and I didn't want to get immediately evicted. So I didn't bring drums and did not drum for 4 years, and played a fair amount of guitar and rented a little upright piano. So I kept my piano chops going, and I actually came here to study piano. So I was playing a lot of piano at that point, but I had not drummed in a long time, and just started listening to a lot of music. This is pre being a father, and I was in my young 20s, and I didn't have a work visa at the time. I was just here to study, so I had tons of time to myself. And once I finally got drums back in my life around 1994, I moved here in 1990, I noticed that my drumming was better. And I couldn't figure that out. And I think it's because I learned a lot from listening to records that were out during that 4-year period. And the early 90s was an amazing time for music. It was incredible, from East Coast hip hop, Tribe Called Quest, and everything that happened out of New York at that time. to all kinds of things that I'm currently blanking on. But I know that the 90s in general was great, but in particular, the first half of the 90s I thought was amazing for music. It was just great, creative, still very song-based, and I loved it. And I was listening a lot to stuff. I was watching a lot of MTV and a lot of this channel that doesn't exist anymore called The Box here in California. It might have been nationwide in the US, I don't know, but it was like a paid video jukebox. So you could like call, you'd make a phone call on a rotary phone and you charged $1 and you could pick whatever they were going to show next. And they'd show a lot of more fringe kind of underground stuff, and I was really, really, really into it. And then started listening to like songwriters, and there was this one Linda Ronstadt record that's like not a cool record at all to reference, but there's a few tracks on it I don't love, but pretty much everything else on it I just love. And it's Lee Sklar on bass, Mike Landau on guitar, the unfortunately deceased Carlos Vega on drums, who was one of my favorite drummers, and Linda Ronstadt, who's an amazing singer, and Aaron Neville did a bunch of duets on that record. David Campbell, Beck's father, did all the string arrangements, and it's so good. George Massenburg produced and mixed it. It's a gorgeous record called Cry Like a Rainstorm, Howl Like the Wind. I'm pretty sure I got the title right. And the songs are incredible. They're written by Jimmy Webb, and I'm blanking on the other featured songwriter on that record, but incredible. And Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil had a big hit song called I Don't Know Much. Beautiful ballad. And that record really influenced me. The first Seal record really influenced me. Trevor Horn's debut record with his artist Seal. The songwriting on that, the production on that, and there's a great Canadian jazz musician named Don Thompson, who is also a multi-instrumentalist. He plays he's an amazing upright bass player. He's an amazing piano player. And I'd never met him, but there's a story about him where he biked across Canada, and Canada is geographically bigger than America. It's huge. And from coast to coast, like America, it's roughly 3,000 miles, and he did that journey. And while he did it, he was practicing a piece in his head the whole time, but not playing it. And whenever it was over, I don't know if he went there and back or just from coast to coast one way, but he sat down and played the thing, like basically perfectly, having never really played it before. And there's stories of I think it was Rachmaninoff or Liszt, one of the famous, amazing, badass classical composers who were also heavy-duty pianists. And he learned a piece on the train on the way to a concert where people had already bought tickets, and he was going to perform that night. But he had just learned it on the train, just reading the music and getting it in his head. So I think that I am a better musician now than I was then. I can't play as well as I used to be able to play. But I think my instincts of how to get out of the way of something are better now, because I recognize that it's not about me. Like I can sit down and we can start writing a song right now, and I could rely completely on craft. I know lots of chord progressions. I know too much about music. I have perfect pitch. I can tell you all kinds of stuff. I've analyzed Bach fugues. I have all this stuff kind of in my bone marrow. But none of that stuff helps the idea show up. In fact, it can get in the way. And I didn't know that until I tried, hundreds of times to write a good song. But it really does sort of inhibit it. And I would rather wait until I start hearing something in my head now. That's usually how I songwrite. Or even producing a record, I try to hear the record in my head, to sort of have a feeling of what I want it to be, and that helps direct, even if it winds up changing. So, my sort of muscle flexy party trick prowess as a musician, it's still there. It's not as razor sharp as it was, but I feel like I've developed another set of concerns and boxes I want to tick that maybe weren't that apparent to me before. And it's made me a better music maker. It's definitely made me a better record maker. The first time I walked into a real recording studio, there was a musician in Peterborough named Peter Brown, who is still a friend of mine. He lives, I think, in Winnipeg now, in Manitoba in Canada. And he was a singer and a songwriter, and he always had his own band. And I started playing in his band when I was about 15, I think, maybe 14, 15. And he raised some money, and he wanted to go to this studio on the outskirts of Toronto, but like a real studio with a big console and outboard gear. I remember they had an emulator, one of the first incredible sort of samplers. And I walked in, and my first reaction as someone in my mid-teens was looking at all the knobs and all the gear, and I felt almost angry that I would never understand this stuff. It looked so intimidating and so complicated. And I was really taken aback at how scary it all looked to me. And I just thought, damn it, I thought like this was going to be a big moment for me. And I, like being in a studio, I've always dreamt about this. I'd never been in a recording studio before. And it just felt so not friendly and cozy. Really did a number on me. Of course, now, octogenarian that I am, it's just all volume control. They're just volume knobs. That's all it is. It's the EQ is a volume knob for a specific frequency. Compression is volume control. It's all just volume control, just a lot of volume controls. But I got my feet wet there, and we recorded a bunch of songs, and I was drumming, and he had me playing bass, and I still have the bass from that session because Peter, who was also probably still a teenager at the time, he ran out of money at the end of it. But we had gone to the local music store in my hometown and bought a good Ibanez bass for me to play on these, because no one owned a good bass. And he said, well, I don't have any money, but you can keep the bass if you want. And I still have it. And my kids have learned to play bass on it. I played that bass on so many records. It actually sounds really good. It's like an Ibanez copy of a P bass, I think. Maybe it's a jazz bass copy. Anyway, it's a great bass. Ibanez still makes great sounding basses. Anyway, that was my first experience in a studio. And then when I got to Humber College, when I was 17, 18, 19, one of the teachers there asked me if I wanted to make some extra money on the weekend. And that, what he meant was he wanted me to go play on some jingles that a friend of his was recording, again, in a real studio. And I went, and it was my first time, maybe my second time playing to a click track. And I loved it. I really loved it. I was more of an up and running musician. I had a lot more experience by that point. I think I was 18. And then I wound up doing some other sessions at that same studio, but I was a drummer on that session. And that was for the Leahy family that's from Lakefield, Ontario, just outside of Peterborough. Amazing family of 11 kids who just do incredible sort of Irish folk music and dancing and that whole thing. They just grew up in it. Now their kids are doing it. And they hired me to be their drummer on a Christmas album, which I still have. It's on vinyl. And I loved it. And then just started, I met a lovely guy named Lou Pamonti in Toronto. We're still good friends. Lou is a great piano player, and he remains the top call session keyboard player in Toronto and has been since the 80s. He's just an incredible, intuitive musician. And he's a great guy, and he took a liking to me. I had this terrible mullet and covered in acne, and it looked completely like I'd fallen off the turnip truck, because I had. But he invited me to his house several times and took me under his wing and started using me as his sub. If he couldn't make a gig, he'd put me on the field and say, go ahead. And that entered me into the world of Toronto jingles. And we're playing on a synclavier, and there's like fancy jingle studio and other situations, and then just met a bunch of Toronto musicians, and they would want to do demos, and we'd get to go into some of the great Toronto studios, some of which are still there, a lot of them aren't. And then what really kicked in the whole production and engineering, record making itch for me was I very luckily got to join the Kim Mitchell band. And Kim is a great musician and songwriter and performer and singer who's had a long, storied career in Canada. I was in a band called Max Webster, who often was on tour opening for Rush around the world. Sort of a little bit like the Canadian Frank Zappa, kind of. Not quite as nuts and weird as that, but not too far away from that. Very creative, very brave. And then Kim went on to have a solo career, and that's when I joined his band after he was a couple albums into his solo career. And right when I joined his band, he was making his new album, and it was at the time being produced by a guy named Paul de Villiers. And Paul had a huge hit with a band called Mr. Mister. In the 80s when I was in high school. There were 2 songs from that record, just were everywhere, called Broken Wings and Kyrie Eleison, huge radio hits. It sounded amazing. And I got to work with Paul and Kim in a studio in Toronto called McClear Place. And Paul was just so enthusiastic and so incredible. And I was often just in the room with Paul. And Paul he's brilliant, but he has the enthusiasm of an 8-year-old. And I would say, I don't really understand what compression is. Can you show me? And he's like, watch this. And he'd go, here's a Mutt Lange drum sound. And he would make the drums that were already recorded sound like it was on, Def Leppard's Hysteria. Watch this. Here's a Terry Brown Rush drum sound. Here's this. Okay. Here's a Trevor Horn drum sound. And he was so fast. And he'd go to the outboard, change everything. He didn't care. And show me. And his enthusiasm for record making was just so contagious. It was so contagious. And he was really successful and really intelligent and really friendly and really serious, but really plugged into the right spirit of record making and music making and just sort of life. Brilliant dude, very philosophical, turned me on to some of my favorite books. And we went for a walk one night just to clear our heads around the block in Toronto on a hot summer, humid night. And he said, I really think you should consider moving to Los Angeles. I think you should really think about it seriously. And that was like so exciting and scary at the same time, but I never let it go and did. And unfortunately for me, happily for him, but he moved away from LA pretty much as soon as I got here. I wound up here 2 years after he said that. And for his own reasons, he left, and he was kind of done with the music business, and has been skiing pretty much the whole time since, and having a really great life. And I just spoke to him on the phone several months ago, and he sounds really happy. He sounds exactly the same, and he was just happy to get out of the big city. But his enthusiasm and having Paul model how to be a record producer for me, and how to like dive into the gear and get your hands really dirty and really create stuff that I didn't understand, was like the biggest carrot you could put in front of me, and that's what really kind of like started this big cheese wheel rolling toward wanting to be a record maker. I feel very indebted to Paul and to Kim for hiring me, which led to me getting to work with Paul. And Paul was Kim's choice, and I'm still working with Kim. I love Kim. I'm actually helping him make his new record right now, many, many, many years later. In terms of really learning the craft of getting to try this stuff myself, I started playing on sessions here in LA. I was recommended by my piano teachers who I came here to study with, and I didn't know that was going to happen. They started putting me up for playing piano on song demos, and I met a few engineers in the process that I had a nice click with, and met a couple of engineers, Brian Schubel and Steve McMillan, who I did a lot of work with both of them, and they had both worked on records that I was a huge disciple of, and they're both just the nicest, sweetest dudes, and they were very happy to share everything with me. And I learned so much from them both. Brian is very creative, kind of very much comes from the Chad Blake school of, and their friends, like, of experimenting and just running stuff through 5 different guitar pedals and, envelope filters, and just the weirder the better, and throwing a ton of pasta against the wall and then keeping the winners, just experimenting. And Steve McMillan was sometimes he was the engineer for Trevor Horn, and he'd worked a lot on the Seal record that I was obsessed with, and Seal's second record. And Steve mixed a lot of both of those albums. And I was, for all of 1994, when I stopped playing with Katie Lang after 3 years, I wound up working with songwriter and producer Rick Knowles, and I was Rick's arranger and studio kind of track guy, multi-instrumentalist for over a year. I think it was a year and a half. And I got to work a lot with Brian and Steve during that time. And there would be downtime because Rick is also, like me, he's a songwriter, and he's not always just producing. And Rick had a really great home studio. And I remember Steve showing me how an API EQ works, that the more you turn it up, the tighter the bell gets. It starts kind of wide and then does that. I didn't know that. And he said it's really great for piano. If you crank 8K or 16K on an API EQ, it sounds amazing on piano. And then you want to compress it because it'll get really peaky. I'm like, well, how do you mean? And he would show me all this stuff. He showed me how to work in 1176 for vocals. And it was just hugely, hugely inspiring. And then when I got my very first production gigs in LA in the late 90s, the minute there was a budget to hire someone like Michael Brower or Chris Lord-Alge or Tom Lord-Alge, I did. And I would show up. I wasn't in person at Michael's session because he was in New York, but the Alge brothers on 2 different projects got to work with him. And Chris in particular, I remember saying to him, the first time I worked with him, I'd never really heard vocal sounds like Chris's vocal sounds. Or Chris's everything sounds, but the vocal sounds were really, really just so clear and exciting, but full at the same time. And I didn't know what was going on. And I remember saying to him, it was just the 2 of us in his control room. And, I'm all like kind of polite and Canadian, and Chris is like full on New Jersey, friendly, but we're doing a thing, and there's an energy to Chris, and he likes to work fast. And I felt bad asking him. It's like I'm just kind of interrupting his flow, but I said, do you mind, is it okay if I ask you what you're doing to your lead vocals? Because I've never heard lead vocals sound like that before. And Chris said, he looked at me, he's like, it's a little of this, it's a little of that. And I just sort of, it's just stuff I've learned over the years. And he kept working. And I said, well, really, would you mind just walking me through it? I'd really like to know. And he looked at me again, he's like, do you really want to know? I'm like, yeah, I really want to know. And he's like, oh, okay. And he showed me everything. He showed me every little nook and cranny, and it's not simple. I couldn't believe how much was going on. I couldn't believe how well thought out it is and was, how complicated it was, and how he blended all of it and balanced it and just made it feel to where you didn't even hear the gear anymore. And you just heard this amazing vocal performance, blaring through the speakers and making me feel great. And so, of course, I tried in my own way and whatever gear I could afford at the time to emulate that. And I've done that with kind of everybody. I remember I worked with Tony Maserati on something in the mid 2000s, and he was in New York at the time. He's in LA now, but I remember thinking, my God, how are you getting that vocal sound? How are you doing it? I recorded that vocal, I produced the vocal, I comped the vocal. At that point, I felt like I knew a fair amount about how to make a vocal sound good. I couldn't understand how it sounded so good. And I asked him on the phone, and he told me everything he was doing. Most of us are very happy to share this information. A couple aren't. It's fine, I get it. But I feel like, even if I set my vocals up to do exactly what Tony was doing to this singer, once I sort of got my ears on it and my whatever, I would probably wind up modifying it to whatever I thought felt right in the track. Like everyone, even with the exact same tools, everyone's going to make something that really reflects them more than like a direct copy of somebody else. And I try to do that with people. I don't really have any secrets at all because we all have our own thumbprint and there's no escaping that. But just like asking stuff. And then the final thing I'll say is in this room, I worked a lot with the incredible Joe Ciccarelli, who is just in a class by himself. Lovely man. And again, very happy to share his knowledge, but I have spent months in the studio with him. making records. And at that point, which was the first time I really got to spend a ton of time with him, was on Mika's first album, Life in Cartoon Motion. And that was in 2006. And I was really paying attention to everything Joe did. I remember the first song I did with Mika was Grace Kelly, which wound up being his biggest hit. I wasn't even hired to produce the record at that point. I was here exactly like we got here today. I brought drums, brought some guitars, brought a bass. Maybe I brought a keyboard, maybe I didn't. Actually, I don't think I had any kind of keyboard at the time. And I was auditioning to be Mika's producer. And I was sort of auditioning him. It's like there was no fee for me. There was no budget to record. But they agreed to cover the studio and cover Joe. And when I heard Mika step up to the mic, I couldn't believe how good it sounded sonically. And Mika's a great artist and a great talent. But the capturing of Mika's vocal was just killing me. And I'm like, Joe, what are you doing? What's going on? And he said, well, this is my favorite 1073. It's a great microphone modified. It's a Neumann U47 modified by a guy named Klaus Heine. I hope I'm saying his name right, in Portland. They still have that mic here. I'm going to Joe's 1073, his top one. He's got two in the rack. It was the top one. Little bit of top shelf, little bit of 100 hertz. Then it went into an 1176 with a particular setting. Then it went into an LA3A with a particular setting, two compressors, one after the other. And then the final piece was a Lang PEQ2 EQ that was, it's not in the control room right now, but it was at the time. And I remember Joe was down low and he was reaching down and just like boosted a little bit of super tippy top. And I just couldn't believe what was going on. And so that basically has become my vocal chain. It took me years to find a 1073 that sounded as good as Joe's. I found one that sounded almost as good, and I love it. And now I use the Undertone mic pre, which is just incredible. I still have both. I'll sometimes swap between the two. Most of the time I'm on the Undertone now. And I use an 1176 on every vocal, and it's usually followed by, I don't have an LA3A, but I have, other more optical compressors that I like to use, slower than an 1176. They say that memory is based on your emotional connection to whatever the thing is that you may or may not remember. And to me, anything that helps me make a better record just sort of sticks with me like a thumbtack, And that's how I really got to, but it's by watching people do this stuff, which is why I think it's really important if you want to make great sounding records, which is almost impossible to do. I think it's really important to emulate and learn from people that are further down the road than you. That's how we learned how to speak whatever language we speak. We didn't come out speaking Spanish or English or Japanese. You learn from the people around you, and you got to do that with this stuff. It's very unnatural making recorded music sound good or great or excellent, which is almost impossible. And watching things like this, there's so many things. There's some great schools out there. And anything you can do to kind of hone and practice your craft is massively important. And for me, the most important component of that is by shutting up and paying attention to people that have done it longer than you. And at this point, I suppose I am one of those people, but I still kind of feel like I'm not. But there's so much to be learned by just admitting you don't really know what you're doing and asking for help, asking people, like, what are you doing? How are you doing that? There's no shame in that. There's nothing but upside in it for all of us. The reason I'm into doing stuff like working with Puremix or any of the other educational stuff I do, or just simply showing up and talking about this stuff at a school or at the NAMM show or, Pensado's place or anything like that, is it's so much fun to share my sort of battle stories and imbue other people with the urge to create their own stuff. That turns me on so much. It turns me on creatively more than at this point than me creating my own stuff, which of course I love doing, and that's my job. That's what I get up every workday and try to do. But I really love encouraging people to express themselves and to have the confidence that You can go into something like whatever it is, studying origami, working in a forest, doing music, acting, writing, meditating for a month, whatever you want to do, go do it and go do it a lot. And I feel like that message it's out there probably more than it ever has been in human history, but it's really not a big message in the world. And I feel like it should be. I feel like it should be one of the biggest messages, that you should follow your gut instinct about whatever it is you're interested in, whether it's making pasta or traveling or whatever it is, whatever weird thing that it feels like. And it will feel weird, and it will feel like something maybe you shouldn't trust. But, I'm not a big sci-fi guy, but I do equate this to, Star Wars. It's like trusting the Force. You can't see the Force. You can't get a diploma in the Force. Mom and Dad, I'm going off to school to study how to be a Jedi. Like, that's basically what it was like for my parents saying, I want to go into music. They just looked at me like, what? You can't be serious. Like, there is no job in music. You're going to become a drug addict, and that, I think there's some supportive parents out there that get it, but it's scary for parents. I get why my parents thought it was a terrible idea. It was just, they didn't know anything about it. And even if they did, maybe they still would have thought it was a terrible idea. I'm not really dying for my own children to go professionally into music. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to stop them, but it's not something that I've pushed on them at all. It's their idea. However, whether you do it professionally or you find another way to pay for your life, and you keep your love of music pure, and you can do whatever you want with your music and not have to kind of like bend and twist it the way that I have to keep the lights on. It's very hard to keep the lights on doing something creative professionally. You got to be very open, and I think that's also another reason why I do so many different things, because it's kept me employed. I don't just do one thing. I'm not just a mixing engineer. I'm not just a songwriter. I'm not just a bass player. I've tried to do all of this stuff, and it keeps me busy all the time. But anyway, yes, encouraging people to let your freak flag fly. Like, that's the coolest thing, and it's a good message for me to tell myself. And anything that I can say here that encourages someone to make your own noise is like, I've done my job. I'm going to give you a piece of creative and business advice all rolled up into one dim sum dumpling. Do the best work you can possibly do. That's the only thing you have control over. You can't control how other people are going to react to stuff. You can't control when a record gets released. You can't control if anyone ever hires you to do anything musically. But you can control how much work and focus you put into something. And don't ever phone something in. Don't ever let music go out the door or down the modem cable or over the interwebs, until you feel like the cake is baked. Because you get one shot at a first listen. And that's who we're making music for. We're not making music for ourselves. That's music in a vacuum, which to me isn't really music. This stuff is to be shared. You got to be really selfish to focus on your thing, on your craft, on your music. But ultimately, it's about being very selfless, and you're sharing it with everybody. You're saying, here's my innermost thoughts. Here's the way I'm feeling about a thing. And the bar is so high to get music to a place where it just shows up as like, oh, that's something, maybe I want to listen to that, for the average music consumer. For every bad song on the radio that most of us could sit around and go, that is terrible, how's that even on the radio? There are thousands of worse versions of that same kind of song that just weren't quite good enough to make it to the platitude of being played on the radio. Not that radio uses like, well, we think this is really good, and that's why they're going to play it. There's a whole other set of concerns, and it's about raising advertising revenue. But still, at some point, the second time I went to the Grammys, the first time I was nominated for something, I was sitting on the floor, and I was watching Prince duet with Beyonce, and then like Tina Turner came out, and U2 played. I might be merging different Grammy performances, but just that level of talent. And I'm sitting on the floor, at Staples Center, being completely blown away by what's going on. And then I was thinking, like, there's people wherever around the world, in my hometown, in Iowa, in Bulgaria, wherever, they're watching this, and they're like considering flipping the channel because it's just something on TV and it's people performing and it's music, and no one's really appreciating the craft or how hard it is to do what they're doing or to get to that point. It's just sort of normal to them because we're saturated with content. We're saturated with fantastic, incredible athletes and actors and everything. Even the quality of food around the world has gone up so much. Like, I remember trying to eat, I shouldn't say this, but like, you go to London, England now, and the food is incredible. I remember going there in the 80s and I had real trouble eating there because I didn't grow up there. It was a really specific taste. Now it's very, there's great, like the pubs are foodie places. That's happened musically. And the norm is at such a level of excellence. So a mistake that I made when I started getting producer jobs from record labels is I really thought that really good was good enough. And I was so ridiculously wrong about that. John McBride in Nashville, the owner of Blackbird Studios, he loves to say, good is the enemy of great. And I'm not sure I've ever hit a level of greatness in record making. Even if other people might say that I have, I don't feel like I have. And so that's the thing that keeps me chasing the electronic rabbit around the racetrack. And you just have to push yourself harder than you might imagine. Some people kind of naturally, intrinsically get that. I didn't. I was just really excited to be employed by a record company, employed by anybody to do anything professional musically, but to really, really, really nail it. And I'm going to give you a shortcut to doing this. And I say this all the time, and I'm going to say it here. And it's hard to do. It's no fun, but it will make you 100 times better at mixing your own tracks. It will make you 100 times better at producing the song you're working on. Here it is. Jack Joseph Puig told me this 13 years ago. Make a playlist of your favorite songs off your favorite records, obviously done by other people, by your favorite artists. It can be any genre. It can be all a big mix-up. Mine is like all over the place, from Public Enemy to Shania Twain to like Michael Jackson to Jay Dilla to Roberta Flack to Green Day to The Weeknd to Charlie Puth. It's all over the place. But they're great sounding records. And make this playlist, 20 to 30 songs. When you're working on your track, because we are talking about recorded music here. This only applies to recorded music. After a couple hours, stop. Go to your playlist. Make sure it's kind of the same volume as the track you've been working on. If it's much louder, it will throw you off. Make sure it's kind of the same volume. Start listening to some songs. Listen to a minute of like 5 songs. It will feel, when you stop and you go back to your track, it will probably feel like a giraffe kick in the face that will send you flying 30 feet. Work for another couple hours on your track. Stop. Go to the playlist. Listen to a bunch of songs for 5-10 minutes. Stop. Go back to your track. Another giraffe has shown up and will kick whatever's left of your head 30 feet back again. And I advise you not to do this in front of clients because it's really humiliating. Keep doing that. Do it all the time. Don't forget to do it. Don't get lazy. Don't think that what you're working on is right. In terms of the production and the sonics of the mix and the balances and everything, go reference your playlist. And, if you've been working on something that has way too much bass, you'll listen to your playlist and you'll think, wow, none of these records have any bottom end. They do. It's just you've overcooked your bottom end and you brainwashed yourself to think it's right because you've listened to it for a couple hours or longer. So acclimate to your playlist. Acclimate to where that sounds amazing again, and then stop and then go back to what you're working on. Keep doing that. I've been doing that now for 13 years. Definitely tons of giraffe kicks for the first couple of years. Then it kind of became like a donkey kick. And then a couple of years after that, it became like my kid's kicking me or something, and now it's sort of like down to a nose flick. That's what it feels like to me. And then every once in a while, I'm there, and the thing I'm working on sounds like it could be on the playlist. Doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen, and it took years to get to that point of just pounding it into my subconscious, like the framing of great production and great storytelling through music, and letting the singer shine, and things to do with the mix that are exciting, and the tension and the release, and the tension and the release, and different techniques that people use, and the groove quality, and the level of the kick drum, and the top end on the vocal, and the body of the acoustic guitar, just all this stuff. It will never get worse if you do that. It will only get better. And I'm telling you, if you only listen to one thing that I say in this entire, I'm giving like really long answers, but if you only listen to one thing, that's the one. That's the one. It will make you so much better at what you're working on. And it will never throw you off track. So try it.